important things that if I could say to you that I really would like you to remember is from the first class is that all biblical authors have an agenda, right? And it's no different from the authors of Genesis. They are writing for a purpose. And unless we know that purpose, we're going to get really, really lost in Genesis. And we're either going to say, this is fake, or we're going to just give up. Remember, we read that little excerpt about saying Genesis is so far separated from the people that Genesis was written for, right? They were worried about, fulfilling their hunger and staying safe. And today we're just so ahead of that. With many, many years, we're far advanced. And those things might seem trite to us today, but they weren't for the people that were reading Genesis. They were written for people who are searching for where is God in all of this, right? The same as we are today. That's the connection we have to the people of Genesis. We share our humanity with them. We share where is God in this world. But the situations that they were in are much, much different than ours. So demythologing the pagan world order with polemic theology. So if you remember, apologetic is a defense. It's a defense of your faith. Somebody has said something and you defend the faith, right? It's defense. But a polemic actually takes something that does not believe is right and it attacks it. It's the offense. You're going to attack somebody else's point of view, in this case, theology, polemic theology, theology meaning the study of God and nature of God. And so this is what the Genesis authors are going to do. They're going to attack surrounding pagan theology. So this is a wonderful quote, right? The Bible is guilty of crass plagiarism. So the answer to that is yes and no. There are some things that we're going to see that do look like plagiarism, but it's not plagiarism in the sense that we would think of plagiarism today. Like, why should I believe? Why should I believe Genesis? Because, well, I can read other flood narratives that sound almost very much like Genesis. Belief of the writers of Genesis is any means that you can get this story out of is acceptable to use. And I mean, we see that jumping forward, we see that with Paul, right? When Paul goes into these towns, right? They're Greek. They're worshiping lots of gods, right? He goes and he sees this marker that says, an unknown God. And he decides he's going to present that to them as Yahweh, right? So yeah, borrow from your culture whatever gets the word out. Chosen's a really good example. Sit down and watch The Chosen. There's a lot of things that are borrowed, right? Is poetic license in The Chosen. But on the same token, The Chosen is bringing a whole lot of people to Christ that might not have ever opened the Bible. And this is kind of the idea of Genesis. It's going to borrow from these things that it absolutely deplores and doesn't believe, but it's going to get its message across by borrowing from a despicable culture. So this is a really famous creation story that comes from Babylon, Enuma Elish, and it is a genuine creation story. It's very, very similar to Genesis, and we're going to look in what ways. So here we see both of these stories side by side. You would sit and read both of these, the Genesis 1 creation account, you would read the Babylonian creation account. You would see these common things. Matter in both of these stories is pre-existent. There is a Tehom means the deep in Genesis. We talk about the deep before creation, before God brings order to chaos, right? And it is linguistically connected, to Tiamat, who is a goddess in Babylonian culture, right? She's the goddess of the sea. She personifies the sea. So we have this commonality between this, right? The Tehom, the deep, it's related to Tiamat's name. Darkness precedes the creative act in Genesis. Darkness precedes the creative acts, right? In the Babylonian account. Creation consists of God bringing order out of a watery chaos. The same is true for the Babylonian account. Creation occurs over 7 days in Genesis, and the Babylonian creation, it occurs over 7 tablets. There's 7 different tablets. Yahweh creates a firmament, right? The separation between the sky and the land. Marduk, who is the prime god in Babylon, right? The chief god, he creates the firmament also. Yahweh creates luminaries. Marduk creates luminaries, right? Yahweh makes humans, right? And the same as Marduk, only he does it out of the blood of the slain Tiamat, the 6th tablet, right? God makes humans on the 6th day. Marduk makes humans, but he does it after he kills Tiamat. And he does it in the 6th tablet, though, right? Humans are created after everything else, and then God tasks them to care for the earth. Same thing here, right? Humans are created after everything else. And then Marduk right? Task them to do the work of the gods so the gods can rest. A little bit of difference, right? Humans are made in God's image. Marduk makes them from the blood of a dead god, right? There's similarities in these two stories. The same is true between Genesis and Egyptian stories, creation stories. We know that Egypt has a tremendous influence on Israel. Of course they do, because Israel was enslaved there for 400 years. They were adapting Israel's culture. And so the Israelites are taking a lot from Egyptian creation stories, who is also at this point starting to lean towards monotheism. And here are the similarities between Genesis and Egyptian creation stories, right? There's one God who creates everything that exists. Egyptian creation, one God who creates all that exists. The cosmos are caused by this God speaking in both of these accounts. Right. God creates light to overcome chaos, right? God creates vegetation, fish and birds, humanity. And the same in the Egyptian creation stories. God creates light to overcome darkness, creates all of these things, right? The same as Genesis. Very striking similarities again, because at least at one point in her history, Egypt was moving towards monotheism, where Israel is getting all of these ideas, right? All these cultures. And we can contribute this, right, to the fact that they all share the same worldview, right? They are all, they're sharing a worldview and a life view that's very, very similar. So it would not seem unusual that there would be these similarities in their stories. Right. It's a familiar context. And bear in mind that these stories, these pagan stories of creation, are written long before Israel comes along. So they are established stories when Israel starts to tell her story. And so, yeah, she's going to borrow from the form of these stories to tell God's story, to tell Yahweh's story. It isn't surprising. It doesn't mean that it's not true. It just simply means that this is the way that they understood, right? Communicating about how creation comes about, how you communicate about your God. So they adapt that form to tell their story about their God also. It's a reflection of her culture, right? It's a familiar context. And that context we call today ancient myth. Now, when you say myth, what do you think about? When you hear the word myth, what do you think about? The dragons it's got, unicorns it's but that is not what this refers to, right? We're going to talk about myth this class quite a bit. When we talk about ancient myth, right? It's a traditional or sacred story that's concerned with reality. It's not fiction, it's not a fable, right? And they usually would use this genre of ancient myth to explain a people's history, to explain a social phenomenon, right? So what I want you to do throughout this class, when you hear this word myth, I want you to think of this, right? The creation stories. I don't want you to think of this. That's not what myth means in this ancient culture. It is how people explained their history. And so they use this form of myth to tell the story of their God. And while they look very, very similar because they're using the same genre, it is more striking to look at their differences. That there are differences that make all of the difference in the world between Israel and her pagan neighbors. These are the main differences that are super, super important, right? Genesis is monotheistic. There is no doubt that the Babylonian creation story is not. There's lots and lots of gods in this creation story. Marduk kills one of them. Yahweh creates in 31 verses. It takes 900 verses to create in the Babylonian story. And it's also, if you ever sit down and read it, it's just like divine melodrama. That's the perfect term for it. Divine melodrama. It is really gory and graphic. The world is created through Yahweh's command. The world in the Babylonian story is created from Tiamat's body. Right? Marduk kills her, and then he separates her body in half, and then the sky is made from one part of her body, and the water is made from the other, the land, the earth, the water. And this one is super important. Yahweh is eternal, right? Pre-existing. In the creation story in Genesis 1:1, God isn't created, right? God is eternal. Very, very different in pagan creation stories, right? Marduk is created after other gods. And this is really interesting. You must see in Genesis account, in Genesis 1:1, is that there are not going to be any words that are associated with these pagan gods. You're not going to see the sun, you're not going to see the moon, you're not going to see the sea, you're not going to see the stars, right? Because they are words that are associated as the domains of these pagan gods. And so Genesis totally ignores them, right? They replace them with the more generic terms of light and sky and water, as if to say right? There is no other God that has domain over these entities. Don't acknowledge the sun because they're sun gods. And these two last differences are super important, right? Genesis is an unopposed creation. God just comes in and God just creates, right? But that's not the case in this Babylonian creation story. It comes out of conflict. Creation comes because these gods are in conflict with each other and very violent forces between opposing forces. And that should say of the god of the pagan gods, right? These pagan gods are in battle and conflict with each other, and that's how creation comes about. It's not like God just entering this chaos and just bringing order to this chaos. And this is the really wonderful part, right? The world is made by Yahweh's love. Not the case in pagan creation stories, right? The world is made from violence. Gods are fighting and killing each other. And then in the end, humans are made just because the gods are tired of doing their work and they need somebody to be their servants, right? And we know that God, tasks humans with a job, and it's really as a co-regent job, right? To partner with God to keep creation good. That is not the case in the Babylonian stories. It's just the gods don't want to be bothered with their work anymore, so they create humans to do all the dirty work. So if we focus on these differences, not the similarities, able to see how distinct, unique, and original both Genesis and ancient Israel's world and life views are. It sets them apart from any of their neighbors in a huge way that would have never, ever crossed the minds of people in Babylon and Egypt. And it also sets their deities apart. Their deities would never do anything in love like Yahweh. And that's exactly what the authors of Genesis intended, to show the difference between their God and these fake gods. So from gods to God, right? Polytheism versus monotheism. So I want you to look at this. Here's some of an examples, just a few of the Mesopotamian gods. If you look at each of these, you'll see that they each have a domain, right? Here's the moon god Sin. Here's Tiamat, right? Who's killed and her body is torn apart by Marduk to establish the earth, right? But look, each thing, each natural phenomenon, the planets, everything has a god attached to it. Here's good old Marduk here, the supreme god of Babylon. There are gods that are gods of the mountains, gods to birth animals. There's a goddess of alcohol and beer. The evidence today that we have, this knowledge that we have today, right? There's floods, and you're like, oh my gosh, what God did I anger to do this to me? Right here. Am I going to infuriate one of these hundreds of gods? And what is that God's retaliation going to be to me? Look at this stark difference between all of those gods and this. That's huge. All of these gods versus this one God. And much of those differences depend on the nature of the creator, right? So this is really super important, right? So here is Yahweh, here is God's the nature of these creators. So God is set apart, right? He works within the universe, but God is not part of it. God comes into human history, but he's not part of human history. He's set apart, part of, but not in. It's in, but he's not part of it, right? But that's not the case with the gods who are personified in nature. And because they're personified in nature, it means that they have very limited powers. Their powers are restricted to their domains, right? So if you're an air god, you have no power over the sea. You have no power over fire. You have no power over anything that is not part of your domain, right? So you have this restricted power. We don't see this in Yahweh, right? Yahweh has unlimited power and authority. God alone creates the universe. The idea being that God alone governs it as well. The gods, right? What is their temperament? Well, just like us humans, right? They have temperaments just like humans. They're not, they're not holy. They act like us. They're fallible like us, right? They act immorally. They act tremendously immorally. If you've ever read any of pagan literature, they're tremendously immoral, compete with each other. They're jealous. They don't like each other. Yeah, they sleep with their own children. Yeah, they have no morals. There's nothing moral about pagan gods. They die. Some of the Egyptians' gods die. They're not eternal. Unpredictable and selfish. You don't know when you're going to PO somebody off. And if you do, you know that they're vengeful as well. There's going to be retribution and consequences to what you've done. And it's not going to be small consequences, right? It's going to be huge. You're going to lose your family. There's going to be a famine. There's going to be illness. It's huge. These gods are thought to be so temperamental and vindictive. But then we look at Yahweh, right? Yahweh doesn't reflect the flaws of human nature, right? Instead, humanity is made in God's image. It's not the other way around. God isn't made in our image. Yahweh has supreme control. These other gods, right, the pagan gods are hierarchical. They have a hierarchy. And many of them can't resolve problems without going to the God that's on the higher up, right? They answer to somebody. Humans, right, created by God for the purpose of relationship, right? This quote from Leviticus, that God dwells among his people. This is a good quote, Paul, right? I will not abhor you. This, I think, is God's word, right? I'll walk among you, be your God, and you'll be my people. You never see this in the pagan gods, right? They're created to do the God's work. There's manifested disdain, that they're violent, they kill humans, they're distant and impersonal. They would never, ever think about living among their creation. The birth of the gods, right? There is none. Yahweh is pre-existent. The pagan gods, right? Most of them are conceived in human terms amongst themselves, sometimes with the children. Sometimes they do human things with humans and they produce demigods, right? There's no pre-existing God. And we see in Yahwehism, right? It's non-mechanical. Worship is non-mechanical. Religion, right? It's heart-centered. God doesn't desire external performances. But that's not the case with pagan gods, right? It's something that we call mutual manipulation. You do something to gain the god's favor or ward that god's retribution off. You appease the gods so that they don't take vengeance on you. And it might seem like that in Genesis, right? It might seem that Yahweh is asking for appeasement. But remember the motivation of Yahweh. Yahweh is desiring relationship, right? And it's nothing that you wouldn't do if you're not madly in love with somebody, right? If you're madly in love with somebody, you do everything to please them, right? This is the nature of God. If you know that you have a God that loves you so much, you're going to be so grateful. Well, you're going to love that God back, right? And anything you do for that God isn't going to feel like it's an obligation. And that's how we talk about stewardship today, right? You don't do it out of a feeling of obligation. You don't do it to appease God, because I'm going to tell you all here tonight, you can't get God to love you any more than God already loves you. God loves you to the umpteenth degree. And so whether you go out and you work at a soup kitchen or you don't, that is not going to make God hate you. That is not going to make God love you. God loves you. And if you have this God that loves you so much and would go to the ends of dying a shameful death on a cross, why shouldn't you want to love that God back? That is the basis of Christianity. It's the basis of Judaism, because God loves us so much. It's just a reciprocal love. You do things for people you love, and you don't do it because you feel like you have to. You're not coerced to do it. It's much different with pagan gods. You're doing it so that they don't hate you and take out vengeance on you. But from these differences, we can see how different these gods are. And those differences would have been highly noticeable to Genesis' original audience. And I just want to play one game with you tonight before I let you go, because I just think this is just so cool, right? This is going to allow you to see how jarring Genesis would have felt to its original audience, okay?
Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Goldilocks who wandered deep into the forest. Much to her surprise, she came upon a small, quaint cottage hidden deep within the forest. From its open windows, Goldilocks could smell the delicious aroma of spaghetti and meatballs wafting through the air. 4 bears that lived there had gone out for a walk while their dinner cooled down. Goldilocks pulled up a chair and scoffed down the meatballs before falling asleep on the floor. When the bears came home, everyone was startled and scared. Fortunately, the park rangers came to the rescue and took all the bears to the zoo. The end.
That's not how the story goes. All of those differences you've noticed, that's how it would have felt to ancient Israel. Creation stories from Babylon and the pagan nations around them. They know Egypt's creation stories. And so when Genesis gets plugged into these familiar forms, they're going to notice the differences right off the bat. And that's exactly the point of Genesis. The point is this: it's going to tap into these existing stories because it's going to engage the audience. They know where you're coming from. That's what they've been reared on. But then it's going to take these very familiar things and it's going to change it. It's going to give it this new radical meaning. And your brain is going to hear all of those things that are wrong. You're going to hear there's only one God, not a bazillion. You're going to hear that this God is sovereign, that this God controls everything. There's not different gods for all these things in your life, right? There's not a God that manages this and another God that manages that, right? And you're going to hear that because that's going to be jolting to you. And that's where you're going to find all of these truths about God. But people can only know the difference if they know the original. And that's why you have to think like the original audience. We're not familiar with any of this stuff. We're reading it from a 21st century perspective. So that gets into a snake is talking? Hello, no, that can't be right. But we can't read it like that. We have to read it with these jolting parts of the story that would have been jarring to its original audience. That's where you're going to find the truth about God. In other words, this view of the cosmos, right? The form and imagery and everything else that's familiar in the ancient Near East, right? They're not chosen to espouse these other creation stories. It's not to buy into these other creation stories. It's not really even to borrow them. It's to deny them. Scholars call this denial polemical theology. So, what is polemical theology? It's the use by biblical writers of the thought forms and stories that were common in the ancient Near East. Remember, we talked about the Babylonian creation story and how it was very similar, right? How Marduk does some very similar things that Yahweh would do. However, there were these major differences, right? Especially the fact that who creates people out of a killed God. Creation comes out of violence and jealousy and rivalry among gods. Humans are created to do God's work, these God's work, because they're lazy, right? They don't want to be bothered. They want to live lives of luxury. So they create servants to do their work. But this God Yahweh creates for love, right? There's no conflict. It's a smooth process. Yahweh speaks. He speaks order into the universe. Yahweh speaks and this happens. It's much different. And what makes that difference is that Yahweh is ultimately a power unto himself. Nobody else can compare with the power or sovereignty of Yahweh. And Yahweh not only is the most powerful force in the universe, Yahweh is also eternal. Other gods are created by other gods, and usually in the very human way. They have relationships with each other, and other gods are born. They have relationships with humans, and demigods are born. But not so with Yahweh. Yahweh doesn't need anybody to create him because Yahweh is pre existent and eternal. Yahweh doesn't make humans to be his servants. Yahweh makes humans as co regents to work the earth with him, to be in partnership with him. Yahweh creates people to be in relationship with him because just out of that pure love of Yahweh. Yahweh is about love. These other gods are about vengeance, jealousy, and hierarchy. All of these things would have been the jolting news that would have been heard in Genesis about who God, Yahweh, capital G, really is, right? And they're going to do it in a way that their culture is going to understand. They're going to do it by borrowing these stories that are already there. So they borrow these stories and they fill them then with this radical new meaning. Turns everything on. So there's a couple ways they do this. It's a couple ways that polemical theology is expressed. First through expressions and then through motifs. And they take these very well-known expressions and motifs, which we'll be looking at, and then they apply them to Yahweh. They destroy all these other gods, they apply them solely to Yahweh. For example, so in ancient Egypt, Pharaoh's power is often described by, or to do mighty deeds, is usually described by a strong or outstretched arm, right? A strong hand. And when we read Egyptian royal literature, this is how they express the power of Pharaoh, who again is believed to be a god, right? Pharaohs are believed to be gods. And so you'll see all of these writings about Pharaoh's hand being strong and outstretched, right? But look at these verses.
But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go. And the Lord said to Moses, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hands, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hands, he will drive them out of his country.
It's dispelling the power of Pharaoh, right? And showing how Yahweh is so much stronger. And they're using terminology that their culture would have understood. No, Pharaoh isn't powerful, it's God. And look at these mighty works that God has done. God's hand is the mighty one, not Pharaoh's.
Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt, and with mighty acts of judgment, I will bring out my divisions, my people, the Israelites. Your right hand, Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy.
Again, all testifying to Yahweh's power, right? It's not Pharaoh that's powerful, it's Yahweh. Features ascribed to Pharaoh are reassigned to Yahweh. As Israel's God humiliates, taunts, and destroys the enemy of God's people. The purpose that the author is going for here, right, is to call into question the power of Pharaoh and to underscore the true might of Yahweh. Also see this in the prophets, right? This isn't something that just stops it in the Torah. We see this in the prophets. When Ezekiel goes back and talks about God, and talks about the destruction of Pharaoh in Egypt, he uses this terminology to undermine the earthly power of Pharaoh, right? To break Pharaoh's arm. This one's a great one.
Son of man, I have broken the arm of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. It has not been bound up to be healed or put in a splint so that it may become strong enough to hold a sword. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against Pharaoh, king of Egypt. I will break both his arms, the good arm as well as the broken one, and make the sword fall from his hand. I will break the arms of Pharaoh, and he will groan before him like a mortally wounded man. The arms of Pharaoh will fall limp. Then they will know that I am the Lord.
You see how this is like just Yahweh showing his power through something that would have been familiar. Ezekiel uses this theology to describe the future destruction of Pharaoh's authority and the domain by the more powerful hands of God, which would have been very easily understood, right, in that day. We don't understand that. We don't get it. We're like, well, what does that mean? God's going to break Pharaoh's arms. But now you know, whenever you see in the Hebrew Bible reference to arms, right, or God stretching out his arms, it's a polemic to show the power of God. And so we see in the Book of the Dead, right, we see this phrase, right, thus says. We see it throughout the Book of the Dead. It's used numerous times, and it's usually used when it's by a god to show a god's will. See this also, right? It's used this phrase to preface a command or express the will of a deity. And so biblical authors likewise borrowed this familiar phrase. It's used approximately 500 times in the Torah, 1,200 plus times in the prophets, right? The Lord saith, thus says the Lord. God said, depending on what translation you're reading, right? And here it is, right, in Exodus. Show the will of God, not the will of Pharaoh. This is how they're going to set the stage, right? This battle of gods between the human God, right, of Egypt and the God of the Hebrews.